morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to day 2 of our virtual 2021 Opiate Conference. I'm Cheri Walter, the CEO of the Ohio Association of County Behavioral Health Authorities. I hope you're all enjoying our first virtual Opiate Conference. I certainly attended some excellent sessions yesterday, and I hope you were able to too. As we get started today, I want to again thank all of our conference partners, the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and Director Chris, and the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections, and Director Chambers Smith. They have been our co-partners with this for all of our conferences, and we really appreciate their support. I also want to thank our sponsors, BioCore, HICMA, Interact for Health, Indivior, CareSource, the Ohio Department of Health, the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, and the Cardinal Health Foundation. We have a couple of new sponsors with us this year, but we also have sponsors who, again, have been with us through our entire 11 years. So we really appreciate all of their supports. And I really hope you all will take advantage to visit the conference sponsors and our exhibitors in the WHOVA app in the exhibitors tab. I got to tell you, they've done some really amazing things with an app. They have really learned how to do virtual conferences as well and to give you good exhibits. So please take the time to give them a visit. As a fully virtual conference this year, we're utilizing the WHOVA platform to host all of our activities. And I want to encourage you to take advantage of all the features, not just the conferences, but interact with exhibitors, network with each other, and ask us questions if you have them. We certainly want to make this a conference that's meeting your needs. So if you need something, please let us know. At the end of each day, you're going to receive an email from Michaela Radich with a survey link. The survey is our daily evaluation form, and we're asking you to complete the evaluation each day. And this is a required activity for any of you who are looking for continuing education credits. So please look for that. Probably around a half hour or so after the conference, you will see it come out. Also, for your continuing education credits, you need to be signed in your own device under your own name, and you need to remain signed in for the full session. We're using Zoom to track and verify attendance, but you will need to complete the evaluation form at the end of each day. You know, I keep mentioning Michaela's name, and because Michaela Radich really has done an excellent job of pulling our first virtual conference together. I mean, she has put all of this together. She's been answering questions. She's been working with all of our presenters. So I really do want to thank her. And again, if you have any questions, you connect with any of our team, and all of my staff are doing a great job. Just use the WHOVA app, or you can send us an email. So you don't really want to hear me talk. So we're really going to get started today. We're going to start this morning as we like to start all of our mornings, because we believe this is about people in recovery, and we have to focus on people in recovery. And I'm so pleased to welcome this morning's speaker, Rodney, to the panel. Rodney's been a regular at our opiate conferences. He helps us at our recovery conferences. I mean, Rodney's just one of those guys, you ask him to help and he is there in an instant. And I mean, all the time. So I am so thrilled to be able to focus on Rodney and let him tell us his story. So with that, Rodney, I'm going to hand it off to you, and thank you as always.
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity, because I'm nervous. I don't know why, but that's just what it is whenever you speak. And this is the first time I ever spoke virtually. So bear with me if I make some mistakes. Just hang in there with me, guys. First of all, I just want to say I've been in recovery since July 25th, 2003. Haven't used anything since then. And that's a blessing. And I'm just grateful for that. I'm going to tell you a little bit how it was, what it's like, and what it's like today. And first of all, man, I started as young, man, drinking and just hanging out with the guys. I get excited. I'm loud. I use my hands, and I'm mad because I'm not standing up. So bear with that one too. So it started out with me just drinking and smoking weed. And that probably was at the age of 11, 12 years old. And that's what I done, 11 and 12, man. I was a bad kid. I used to break in houses. I was just a knucklehead. And as that progressed, I go into high school. I'm still doing the same thing, not really paying attention in school, just drinking and smoking weed. And then all of a sudden it moves on to, I'm working at St. Anthony's Hospital. And now I got introduced to this little white thing. It looked like a little football, and it was crack cocaine. And I don't know about nobody else. I can just speak for me. When I first started that, man, I thought I was in heaven. I loved it. I love getting high. I don't know about nobody else, man. When I got high, I loved it. I love getting high. I just loved everything about it. And one thing about it is when it first started, I really enjoyed it. And then all of a sudden, later on down the line, man, I used to do anything and everything just to get one more. And y'all put whatever y'all want to put in there because I probably did it. And I'm not ashamed of it because I did. I can't take it back. But today I don't do anything like that. So as I move on through life, I'm a blown out crackhead. I used to tell you one story. My mom and them went out of town. They left me the keys to the house. And I don't know about nobody else, but being somebody who smoked crack smells money. And I smelled money in this house. I didn't know where it was at. So I just started tearing up the house, looking for this money in my mother's house. End up finding like $450. And you know where that went? That all went up in smoke. And then the Monday came, and she comes home, and she's looking for her money. And I don't know about nobody else. This is me. I start helping her look for it. Like, wow, I don't know what happened for it. And she already knew I had spent it and I'd probably gone. But this is what the disease of addiction will do to you. It done it to me. I can't speak for somebody else. I can only speak for me and what it done to me. It had me helping my mother look for this money that I know I'd already spent. So moving along, now all of a sudden, my last day getting high. First of all, my landlady came over to the house. She knocked on her door and said, "What are you doing? You gotta stop what you're doing." I ain't pay that no attention. Somebody knocked on the door. I got high some more. Then all of a sudden, my sister and my cousin came by. So when they came by, they talking about, "You got to stop getting high. You got to stop doing this." I didn't pay them no attention. Somebody else came in. I started getting high some more. Then all of a sudden, my oldest brother came in. My oldest brother came in and started saying, "I just can't stand what y'all doing. I love y'all all, but I just can't stand what y'all doing." And all of a sudden, he just started praying for the whole house. And I'm talking about I got a whole house full of people getting high. And you could hear a pin drop in that house. And when he came out, he said, "Man, you got a week to pack up your stuff and you leaving." I thought he was just joking. So the week came. Next thing I know, here a U-Haul truck pulling up, my two nephews and him packing all my stuff up. And that's when my life turned around. I think I stayed home that whole day. And the very next day I went into treatment. And that was the last day I used was July 24th, 2003. Now, my story in recovery starts. I go to this treatment center. Don't want to be there. And, I'm a big guy, like to cook, like to eat and all of this, right? So it was an opening in the kitchen. And I love this opening in the kitchen. And they, you're only supposed to cook a certain amount of stuff. This is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're supposed to do. So me and another guy in there. I'm cooking stuff. I see sausage and eggs in there that I'm not supposed to cook. So, me being who I am, I'm like, man, ain't nobody gonna know. Me and the guy, we eating it, and he tells on me. He just straight out tells on me. So when he tells on me, they kicked me out the kitchen. They put me on restriction, and they said, you'll never work in the kitchen again. And then about 5 months later, I'm in a therapeutic community, and one of the counselors said, I don't know what she said to me. I don't even know what she said. I really can't tell you what she said. So I gave her the forget you, but I didn't say forget you. I said something else. And she just shut down community. She shut it down. She stopped everything she was doing. And next thing you know, I'm in the office the next day in front of the whole staff, the director, the assistant director, the lady who I flicked off, and everybody in there wanted to kick me out. And the lady who I flicked off said, that was probably the first honest thing you've done since you've been in recovery, since you've been here in this facility. She's the only one that didn't want to kick me out. I'm like, wow. So all of a sudden, she didn't kick me out. Everybody else wanted to kick me out. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. From that point forth, she seen something in me that I didn't see in myself. From that day, everything changed. I got restricted for 30 days, couldn't go nowhere. I couldn't leave a building. And that was the best 30 days of my life. I got me a sponsor. I called my sponsor. I didn't break any more rules. And I really truly wanted to change. Now I'm changing. I'm doing better. And all of a sudden, this is what it's like today. Today, my life has changed so much, and it's all because of recovery. Just 2 days ago, I came back from a vacation, 5-day vacation. Who would have thought somebody like me, used to live to use, would take a 5-day vacation? Everything's paid. I got money in my pocket. It's paid for. I would never believe that. Today, life is so much better not using, and the recovery piece for me is one day at a time, because check this one out. I can still use anytime I want to, but just for the day, I choose not to. I'm so excited about what I'm doing today and helping people. I'll be doing this for the rest of my life. I love going into the prison systems. I love going into the detox units. I just love helping somebody. I don't care what it is. I love my church family. I love my recovery family. I love my family. I got 3 families in one. Who can beat that? Living 2 lives in one lifetime. I don't know about nobody else. That's what's happening for me. And today, man, it is just so wonderful. Even doing something like this. Who would have thought somebody like me would be doing something like this? Not me. And check this one out. About 2 or 3 years ago, they put me on a commercial talking about recovery. I would have never thought that. And every now and then, I have an obligation not to use no matter what. For me, just for the day, I wouldn't care what happens. Mother died, dog died, cat died, my fish died. I wouldn't care what happened. There's nothing gonna make me use today because of people like y'all, people like my sponsor, my recovery family. One person through this whole COVID-19, Clifford is his name. This is my guy. He called me at least 2 times a week just to check on me. I love this guy. He's my big brother. He's my big little brother, and I love him to death, and I love my recovery. If you don't get nothing else out of this, whatever you do, just for the day, you don't have to use if you don't want to. Thanks for letting me share.
Kay, you're muted. There you go.
Yep, I know. Rodney, thank you so very, very much. And I think we all should give a big round of applause to Rodney for that amazing, amazing gift that he has given us this morning. Oh my goodness, Rodney. You're sharing so openly and beautifully of your life is such an inspiration to all of us. Thank you so very, very much. What a blessing for today. Thank you. Cheri, is Senator Brown available now? Is he on?
It looks like he's just getting on, so it looks like you can go ahead with your introduction.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Kay Spergel. I am the Executive Director of Mental Health and Recovery Board for Licking and Knox County. I'm also the current president of OACBHA. I'm going to welcome you all to today's conference and to say how thankful we all are that you are joining us today. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown has long been an advocate for mental health and substance use services and supports. Senator Brown was first elected to the Senate in 2006. Prior to that, he served in the U.S. House of Representatives, then as the Ohio Secretary of State, and also as a state representative. Senator Brown currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Banking, Housing, and the Urban Affairs Committee, where he's working on a number of housing issues. Senator Brown, thank you so very much for joining us today. At this time, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, we might be having a little technical difficulty. Hang with us here. We know that Senator Brown's trying to get on the line. His staff was there. So Senator, are you still with us? Well, Rodney, while we're waiting, let me thank you. Boy, did you energize us this morning and get us going. Way to go. You are on it, buddy. Here's the senator. Okay.
Hey, folks.
There you go.
You say 9:15. I try to show up at 9:15. How are you?
You're doing good. Thanks, Senator. Thank you so much.
Rodney, your shirt wakes me up this morning. Good thing I got good color in my Zoom. I like that.
Yeah. So,
Hey, Ms. Walter, Cheri, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. You may have missed it. We just introduced you because we saw your name on there.
Oh, you did?
You
Okay.
just popped on. So you've been formally introduced, and I think you're ready to go. And
Wait,
thank you so much for being
I
here.
think I just hang on. Wait a minute. I'm back with you now.
You're there. You're good to go.
Okay, cool. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me. And most importantly, thanks you for the work that you're doing. President Spergel and CEO Walter, thank you for your leadership in all of this. At the end of last year, Ms. Walter had worked with Liz Heinrich to put together a virtual roundtable with behavioral health boards across the state to hear about the important work that you're doing about the challenges you're facing this pandemic. The idea for that roundtable came from Brenda Cronin from Ottawa County. She had suggested in a roundtable we were holding with local leaders, and it really is what's instructed me and helped me as I approach this job, figuring out sort of next steps as we try to move forward. As all of you, we've spent, I mean, so many of you are doing direct service with patients and clients and people that need help. The rest of us, so many of us that have worked at home have spent much time obviously in doing in meetings like this, when at least I would call them virtual roundtables, while I'll sit often with 10 or 20 people and they'll tell me their stories. What you have all dealt with this year is particularly difficult because we've rightly been focused on COVID-19 as the great public health crisis that we're in. But you all know that addiction and mental health crises haven't gone away. The pandemic's only made them worse. The pandemic has in so many ways been the great revealer. It's revealed to us many in society were oblivious to this, the structural racism in our country, the racial disparities, the wealth inequalities, and the issues in mental health that we far too often sweep under the rug. It's been harder for Ohioans with a substance abuse disorder or mental health condition to get the treatment and help they need during this pandemic. The weight of unemployment and stress and social isolation and the general uncertainty we've been feeling only adds more pressure to people struggling to recover. None of this, of course, is news to you. It's important that we recognize that as we begin to move out of this pandemic. I mean, we're not close to being there yet. I spent much of last week going around the state to big and small communities alike, encouraging people to get vaccinated. We still have roughly half the people. I mean, we've made great progress. President Biden promised in his inaugural speech that we'd vaccinate 100 million people in the first 100 days, 1 million a day, obviously. We've doubled that, but it's getting harder and harder as some are reluctant, some are dug in, some are waiting to see if any of their friends or neighbors or coworkers or friends at church or whatever are having reaction. But the weight of all of this has obviously made mental health issues even more important and even more stressful for people. The challenges our children and grandchildren face, the depression, the pandemic has exacerbated all of these, and they're obviously all connected. You've done your extraordinary work as people, as people. It's really the leaders in fighting this, the terrible addiction problems and mental health issues we're facing. You've done it with dwindling resources. We work to fix that in the American Rescue Plan. I mean, we recognize, in large part because of the round tables you set up for me and others doing that around the country, gave us the ammunition, if you will, to go to our leadership and go to President Biden and talk about the needs that we have in our state dealing with mental health issues. We announced this week, we announced Ohio's getting $10.6 billion in rescue plan funding for state and local governments. Through all of last year, we tried to get Senator McConnell and the president in 2020 to move forward on money for local governments. And mostly they turned a deaf ear to that. That $10.6 billion when we passed our legislation in March 6th, I remember that date well because I remember walking out of the building and a reporter said, "What do you think?" I said, "It's the best day of my career," because we've done finally what we need to do in terms of child poverty, in terms of pensions, in terms of direct services and state and local governments and all the things we need to do that way. So that $10 billion should go a long way toward making your local budgets whole and preventing layoffs and service cuts and all the things that you've worried about over the past year. There's already a backsliding where some in this body, some in the Senate and the House, think that we should begin to cut back on these dollars, whether it's unemployment compensation or help for local governments. We'll continue to resist that and continue as much as we can to keep these dollars flowing. We work to make healthcare more affordable for millions of Ohioans. The rescue plan includes funding to lower people's premiums if they get care through the exchanges. The exchanges are what was set up from the Affordable Care Act a decade ago. And the administration opened a special enrollment period for the ACA exchanges, the Obamacare, so-called the American, the Healthcare Act that we passed a decade ago. As I said, we all know how critical it's been getting people the treatment they need, especially through Medicaid. I remember it might have been a decade ago, I was in Cincinnati, the Talbert House, which I assume some people, all of you are familiar probably with the Talbert House in this call. And I remember a father sitting next to his maybe 30-year-old daughter, and he put his hand on her arm and he said, "My daughter's alive today because of Medicaid." And that story obviously has stuck with me for a decade and makes me fight that much harder to make sure that Medicaid that expansion of Medicaid continues and that we do that. So many governors, they're all very, a lot of them, some of those governors are anti-vaxxers. Just the far right that's blocked Medicaid expansion is just makes me shake my head because I know what it's done in our state where we had a Republican governor who expanded it, John Kasich, and how important that is. We now have an administration, though, with President Biden committed to making the ACA and Medicaid stronger and making them work for people. And they're committed to listening to experts like you, people doing this work. And again, through the roundtables last year, I just could see what local governments needed because it didn't matter their party, didn't matter their ideology. They were pleading us to do better. Earlier this year, HHS announced they're expanding access to medication-assisted treatment, something I heard about from a number of you, making it easier for you to get that treatment to Ohioans who need it. We're seeing during this pandemic how important a tool telehealth can be. You've all had to get creative during the last year. We know, though, that many communities don't have broadband. I remember one of the first roundtables I did was with schools around the state, and I heard it in Appalachia, and I heard it in inner cities, metro areas in Ohio. the obstacles they faced because their children, their schools, the broadband wasn't accessible, or the parents couldn't afford to do what they needed to do. So one of the major parts of this infrastructure bill, similar to Roosevelt in the 1930s, expanding electricity. They didn't call it infrastructure in those days, but that was every bit infrastructure. And as he electrified the countryside, you've read in your history books, we need to do the same. And to me, even though some people here who oppose the president's infrastructure bill want to say infrastructure is only highways and bridges and water and sewer systems, surely it's social services, surely it's education, surely it's housing, and surely it's broadband. And that's how those pieces fit together. So I just ask you to keep making your voices heard. You've done that well. They weren't heard enough during the last year because they were in some cases drowned out by the pandemic. But as you serve the public and you fight the scourges of mental illness in so many manifestations, keep talking to us, keep telling your stories, keep speaking out. I'll close with this. It's become a tradition. I bring six, in the Senate, we're doing this every year. I bring 3 Republicans and three Democratic senators to the Senate floor. I just call them and ask them to do this. And we read, the 7 of us just taking parts each, read the letter, Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, written in 1963, exhorting in those days moderate white ministers who were saying to Dr. King, don't go so fast. We want you to have the right to vote, but it's going to take a while. You got to be more patient, Dr. King, and other pastors. And he, King, in his letter to the ministers, admonished them that about the arc of history and the arc of justice and history and all. But my favorite King quote I'll close with, when he said that progress, in the middle of this letter, progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. And it's because of Kay and Rodney and Cheri and Danielle and all of you making that happen and continuing to raise your voices, continuing to advocate, continuing to make demands of me and other elected officials on the local, the state, and the national level, so that we can combat this public health scourge, and we can return more and more people to the normal lives that people want. So thank you for having me, and I appreciate so much the work you're all doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I really want to say we appreciate all your support, and the fact that you did these roundtables and went around the state and we heard from our staff just says that you're really getting out and trying to listen to the folks in your state. And let me tell you, we so appreciate that. So thank you for all your
Well,
support.
keep doing them and keep calling on me, okay?
We certainly will. Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote presentation for this morning. Dr. Danielle Dick will be presenting on why you should care about genetics of addiction, implications for prevention, intervention, and treatment. Dr. Dick is a distinguished Commonwealth professor in the Department of Psychology and Human and Molecular Genetics at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Dick's research involves studying how genetic predispositions interact with environmental factors to contribute to patterns of substance use, misuse, and related behavioral disorders across development. She is the founder and current director of the College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute at VCU, where she launched and co-directs the Spit for Science project. Now that's a name. We're so glad Dr. Dick was able to join us, and we're very excited about our presentation. Dr. Dick, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks for being here this morning.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm gonna start sharing my screen, see if we can get this all set up properly. Okay, is that looking good to you all in proper presentation mode? I got a thumbs up, so thank you. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to be here with you this morning and for spending part of your morning with me. Rodney, thank you for sharing your story. It's a hard act to follow here. The most important credential that I have, which was not mentioned in my introduction, is that actually my father was born and raised in Ohio, in Circleville, and he subsequently joined the military, so I grew up all around the world, but I spent a lot of time rooting for the Buckeyes with my grandparents growing up. So as was mentioned, I'm now a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I direct a large research lab. And we really span basic research to applied prevention and intervention. And so my group focuses on studies that are involved in trying to understand the underlying biology of why some people are more at risk for substance use disorders than others. So we work on big gene identification projects. And then we have a number of studies where we follow from kids through the lifespan, individuals trying to understand, what does it mean to have genetic risk for a substance use disorder? What are early behavioral manifestations of risk? And how can the environment reduce risk or exacerbate risk? And then we attempt to combine all of that to develop more tailored and informed prevention and intervention projects. And so I'm going to be touching a bit on all of these areas this morning with you here. So let's start at the very beginning. We know that substance use challenges are incredibly complex. They are influenced by both genes and the environment. So the heritability of substance use disorders, whether we're talking about alcohol, above about 50% heritable, up to opiates, more like 70% heritable, and other illicit drugs. But really what that means is not, of course, that the reason any one individual develops a problem is 50% because of their genes and 50% because of their environment. It means that about half of what contributes to the differences between all of us and why some of us are more likely to develop problems than others is due to differences in our DNA. Even though we know that these are complex disorders that are influenced by both genes and the environment, often when we think about prevention, intervention, and treatment, we're focused primarily on the environment. And there is good reason for that. And that's obviously an incredibly important area to focus on. But today, what I hope to talk to you a little bit about is how we can also use information about what we know about genetic risk to essentially be using both pieces of that puzzle to tackle these incredibly complex problems. So, starting at the beginning, we know there is no gene for any substance use disorder. There's no gene for addiction, there's no gene for depression, there's no gene for most of the complex kinds of psychiatric and substance use disorders that we all are interested in. Instead, what we know are that there are hundreds or thousands of locations in our genome where different versions can increase or decrease our risk just a little bit. And so we know that, in fact, everyone has some genetic vulnerability to substance use disorders, that risk tends to follow a bell curve like almost all other quantitative traits in the population. And so some individuals are at low risk, a lot carry moderate risk, and then some individuals are unfortunate enough to, through the genetic lottery, inherit a disposition that makes them more at risk for developing substance use disorders. In genetic counseling, the way that we talk about this and help individuals understand what it means that genes play part of the role in influencing substance use problems is to talk about mental health jars. And this is work done by my colleague, Janine Austin, who's one of the world's leading psychiatric genetic counselors. So if you imagine we all have a mental health jar, and that when that jar is full, that's when an individual is experiencing an active episode of illness, active substance use problems, for example. So we start life with some degree of genetic risk represented by the little yellow marbles in the jar. And again, some individuals start with lower genetic risk, many more have moderate genetic risk, and some individuals have high genetic risk from the day they're born, essentially. Now, what we know is that it's not just about genetic risk, though. Over time, you can also accumulate environmental risk. And so represented by these little orange triangles here. These represent environmental risk factors and individual encounters. And so you can kind of see through these examples that you can start life with a lower genetic risk, but encounter a lot of environmental risk factors such that your jar can be full and it can lead to problems. On the other hand, some individuals can start life with a high genetic risk, and hence it doesn't take as many environmental challenges before their jar is full and they're experiencing problems. And for every individual, they of course have their own unique jar, their own mix of both genetic risk and environmental risk. And conceptualizing it in this way, in mental health jars, can also help us think about how we can prevent and then intervene in substance use disorders. And so if a full jar represents an individual who's actively experiencing problems, then you can imagine you both have the opportunity to remove environmental risk. And of course, this is one of the things we are often trying to do when we are intervening and in treatment and to promote recovery, is to remove some of the environmental risk factors, substance using peer groups and places where there's a lot of substance use, et cetera. In addition, we can add protective factors, right? A recovery community, supports, things of this sort. That is essentially like adding to the top of the jar. So it takes more environmental risk factors before an individual experiences problems. So this is a framework that we often use to talk about how both genetic factors and environmental factors can contribute to an individual's risk. And of course, the idea behind precision medicine, or doing basic research, I'll say, is that by better understanding those genetic risk factors, we can develop more effective prevention, intervention, and treatment. In other words, we can better understand what are the marbles in this jar? What are the genetic factors that lead some individuals to be more at risk than others? Because what we know is that different people have different predispositions, meaning there's lots of different genetic variants that can contribute to risk. And so different people could have different types of genetic risk. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means. But we know, for example, that people use substances for very different reasons. There are a lot of commonalities, but there are different pathways that get individuals to the place where they're developing problems. The background behind all of the emphasis and the money that's being put into genetic research is that it's all part of the Precision Medicine Initiative. So this is something that many of you all may be familiar with, was announced by President Obama in his 2015 State of the Union address. And the idea is that right now, oftentimes when people go to the doctor or come into treatment settings, it is when they're having problems. So many of us, some of us are very good and we go in for our annual preventative care, but many of us wait until there's a problem before we go in to see someone about it. Not only that, but oftentimes we don't immediately rush in to see someone. We wait to see if it'll clear up on its own or we can handle it. And then it gets worse. And that is when individuals go in to see someone. And of course, this is a standard pattern that we see in treating substance use disorders. The idea behind precision medicine is that we are all born with our genetic codes. And so we should be able to know something about who is at risk for what different outcome, whether it's psychiatric or substance use disorders or cardiovascular disease or cancers, before the individual ever develops problems. And so the whole idea of precision medicine is that we can move medicine from a treatment-based model to one that is predictive and preventative and personalized to the individual. So in 2016, Congress signed into law the 21st Century Cares Act. It had strong bipartisan support. When does that happen these days? And what it did is it allocated billions of dollars of funding for precision medicine initiatives. And much of that has gone into the All of Us study. There are collection sites all around the country. And essentially, what we are doing is we are collecting over 1 million individuals with healthcare records, with a whole wealth of other data, from sensors to questionnaires to, and by sensors, I mean things collecting like sleep and physical activity, collecting information about lifestyle, about environmental risk factors. And the whole idea is that we are going to have a wealth of data, which we can then mine to better understand what genes, what environments, how it all comes together. So the idea is that all of this data, this wealth, literally millions upon millions of data points, will allow us to get to better classification and diagnosis, and that this will also then lead to better prevention and intervention. And so in a paper that was written by the former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health that came out in the premier journal Science, they essentially talked about how right now, the individuals that come in to the doctor's office or to a clinic for treatment we know they're affected, but they are a mixed bag of differences in genetic risk, in differences in the way their brains are wired, in their physiology, their life experiences. But they're all right now, they come in and have a diagnosis of, say, opioid use disorder, alcohol use disorder. So they're all lumped together. What we will be able to do as we move to precision medicine is to better cluster individuals into groups that might not be visible to the unaided eye, but that have more similar etiological patterns. The same set of risk factors are working in this person to contribute to problems. And the idea is that this will allow us to refine these broad mental disorder categories, and that we can develop new drugs to focus on fine-tuning different circuits that underlie risk. Now, you might be sitting there right now saying, this all seems incredibly science fiction, far-fetched to me, who is in a clinic working with individuals who are showing up struggling with issues. But lest you think that I am really far out there, I want to take you back just 27 years to 1994, to the Today Show, when they were talking about this crazy concept called the internet.
Back now at 56 past, I wasn't prepared to translate that as I was doing that little tease.
Oh, that's
that
right.
little mark with the A and then the ring around it.
At.
See, that's what I said.
Mm-hmm.
Kay said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
But I'd never heard it.
Around.
I'd never heard it
about.
said. I'd always seen the mark, but never heard it said. And then it sounded stupid when I said it. Violence at NBC.
I heard it around or about in the lunchroom the other
See,
week.
there it is. Violence at NBC. GE.com. I mean,
Well, Allison should know.
what
do you
is
say to that,
internet
Allison?
anyway?
Internet is that massive computer
Right.
network, the one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what internet is?
So just over 25 years ago, which, for those of us who are not the college students that I work with, does not feel like that long ago. This was actually when I was entering the field. I had just finished college. 25 years ago, we didn't even think about, we didn't understand the internet. Now, fast forward, it has radically changed our lives. We have an entire generation of children who are growing up never having known life before being constantly connected to other individuals. Genetics is the only field that is advancing at the same pace of computers. We are just 2 decades behind. So what this graph shows here in white is Moore's law. So some of you all might be familiar with this. Gordon Moore was one of the Intel co-founders, and he was the person who first observed that the amount of essentially circuits they could put, or transistors they could put on a circuit, was doubling every year. And that is what led to the ability to go from supercomputers that took up, an entire room at a university or a business and could barely, do something that we would now consider very simple and did it very slowly, to now us all having incredibly powerful computers that, we carry around in our pockets all of the time. So this shows essentially the pace of Moore's law, how quickly computing has advanced. In green, this shows how quickly genotyping has advanced. So the first human genome sequence was published in 2003. It took nearly 13 years and almost $3 billion to generate that one single first human sequence of the human genome. We now, fast forward a couple decades, we can now genotype an individual for less than $100, and it takes a couple hours. In addition, this is now, of course, getting into the business world. So many of you might have participated in companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. There has been an exponential growth just over the last few years in the number of people that are accessing their genetic information directly from these businesses. And you can right now go to publicly available websites and upload your genotypic data, and it will spit out genetic risk scores to give you an approximation of how at risk you are for different types of outcomes. They aren't very good yet. I'm going to get to that, so don't go out and do it. But the point is, there's exponential growth in people who want this information. And in that publicly available website, the third most requested outcome for someone who wants to get a genetic risk score for a particular disease or disorder is alcohol use disorder. 6 out of the top 12 most requested genetic risk scores are for substance use or psychiatric outcomes. People want this information. It is coming. It is advancing faster than most people have any idea of. This is the future. This is precision medicine. It will be personalized. It will be predictive. We will all have our genomes. We will all know what we are at risk for. And hopefully we will be able to better use that information to prevent and to treat substance use disorders. So this is coming. But where are we now? Right now, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of geneticists around the world that team up as part of these large international consortia. I lead some of these. We are collecting huge samples, and by huge, I'm talking millions, several million individuals with particular outcomes. We scan the entire genome, and then we're looking for areas of the genome where individuals who have a substance use disorder, for example, or we do it the same way if you're studying depression or cardiovascular disease or whatnot, but individuals who have the condition are more likely to carry a particular version at that location in the DNA. We can then use that information about which genetic variants are associated with the outcome, whether that's alcohol use disorder or opiate use disorder. We can identify what genes and underlying biological pathways are involved, and we are working to use that to develop better pharmaceutical treatments. But we can also collect information across the genome for any one individual and create a risk score by summing up whether or not they can carry the risk variant at all of these thousands of locations that each elevate or are protective, elevate risk or are protective just a little bit. And we can then use that information for prediction and prevention. So we know that the human genome has about 3 billion base pairs, and what we're literally doing is just testing variation across the genome. And then we are summing up how many of those locations an individual has, weighted by the effect size at that particular location, to create a genetic risk score. And these genetic risk scores then predict a variety of outcomes. And so I'm going to orient you to this slide in a moment, but in a large project that I run, where we're looking broadly at substance use disorders, and we essentially ran an analysis of 1.5 million individuals, tallied up all those locations and created risk scores in 2 other completely independent samples here in the United States. And so what I've done here is broken this up into, remember, there's the bell curve of risk. And down here are individuals that were in the bottom quintile of genetic risk. Up here on this side are individuals who are in the top, the highest fifth of genetic risk. And what you can see, for example, is that individuals at lowest genetic risk have about a 12% rate of ever using opioids, compared to individuals at highest genetic risk, where it's close to 30%. Similarly, ever use of illicit drugs goes from about 20% of the individuals at low genetic risk up to closer to 35% of individuals at high genetic risk. So clearly, they are obviously, genes are only ever going to be part of the story, but we are getting to the point where we can actually create genetic risk scores that provide some information about how at risk, relatively speaking, individuals are. Now, this is what we're working on, but right now our genetic risk scores are not great. So they are not predicting a ton of the variability and outcome, but that is changing rapidly. So the graph that I just showed you is a hot off the press. The paper's coming out in Nature actually very soon, but it predicts about 10% of the variance in whether or not individuals are going to develop different substance use or other kinds of disorders related to self-regulation. But it was only 2% a year or so ago. So again, as we collect more samples and more individuals, and with the All of Us project collecting 1 million individuals, this is advancing incredibly rapidly. I very much think now that within my lifetime, we will be getting genetic information in ways that that seem very sci-fi and far-fetched right now. But that said, clearly that's not what's happening right now in your clinics and in your treatment centers. But we actually know a lot about how genetic risk unfolds and can increase risk for substance use disorders, even without having or knowing all the specific genes. And that's what I'm going to shift and talk about here in this latter part of my talk. So we know that differences in our DNA contribute to differences in the likelihood that individuals will develop substance use problems. So heritability of about 50%, as I mentioned earlier. But what I find is that a common misconception is that people think that that means that it's differences in how their body will physiologically respond to a drug, right? Are they more disposed to becoming addicted to alcohol or to opioids or to cannabis? That many people interpret genetic risk as meaning that it is risk associated with how you will respond to a drug, and that is what causes an increase in the risk of developing a substance use disorder. Certainly, some of that is true, right? We know that there are genes that influence metabolism of alcohol and metabolism of other drugs, and that carrying particular versions of that can, in fact, be protective or make individuals a little bit more at risk. But it actually turns out that that is a very small part of why some individuals are genetically more at risk for substance use disorders. So what we do is we talk broadly about there being kind of 3 different genetically influenced risk pathways. One of the biggest ones is through what we call the externalizing pathway, meaning differences in sensation seeking, in risk taking, in impulsivity. We know that there are genes influence the way our brains are wired, and some of us process rewards and consequences differently. And many individuals, especially those who are more at risk for substance use disorders, have brains that are more attuned to instant reward and to taking risks and the rush that you get with that, much more so than pausing and thinking about long-term consequences and long-term planning. It's differences in how our brains process rewards and consequences. And we actually know that those differences play a big role in why some people are more at risk for developing substance use problems. In addition, we talk about an internalizing pathway. So our brains also differ in how much we respond to, or how predisposed we are to, anxiety or to fear. Some of our brains are on more high alert. We are more attuned and more reactive to things that predispose us toward negative thinking or toward anxiety sensitivity. And we know that substance use, those individuals are more at risk of developing substance use problems via pathways related to drinking to cope and to manage depression and anxiety. And then, of course, there is the piece about how our genes influence how we physiologically respond to a drug. But as I mentioned, it's actually these 2 other pieces that play a much bigger role in why some people are genetically more disposed to develop problems. So to think a little bit about what this means or how this might look. So we might imagine, we know that we start life with our genetic codes. Nothing magic suddenly happens that an individual wakes up one morning and out of the blue has developed a substance use disorder. And part of that, we know that there are pathways of risk. And Rodney talked beautifully about some of his pathways of risk. We know that genotypes that predispose some individuals to be more likely to have problems, say, for example, by predisposing toward impulsivity and risk-taking, well, they show up early in development, right? So they are the small children who are hanging from the tops of trees and giving their parents heart attacks and having them rush to the ER a lot to deal with all these risk-taking behaviors, which can lead to challenges. So we know that the risk-taking child is more likely to be dangling from a treetop at 5, but you fast forward a decade or more, and we know they're also more likely to be doing this. But of course, our dispositions are not destiny. And so that same risk-taking disposition could be channeled into this or into this. And in fact, for full disclosure, this little risk taker is my little risk taker, who certainly comes by it honestly because his father, my brother are all fighter pilots. Who is drawn to flying jets at supersonic speeds? People who tend to be higher in risk taking and that instant, dopamine rush reward seeking. Anecdotally, I also know that there tend to be much higher rates of substance use problems in the families of fighter pilots. Now, the child dangling from the tree is a very different child from this child, right? We also know that the roots of anxiety show up early in childhood. And while some people accidentally or inadvertently dismiss that as they'll grow out of it, they're just shy, we actually know that untreated anxiety, of course, tends to get worse over time. And that in fact, individuals who are more disposed to anxiety and who don't have intervention to help them manage that early on are more likely to develop substance use problems. So what I encourage you to do is to shift from thinking about how prevention, intervention, and treatment focus on the environment, not to shift away from that. That's obviously a critical and important piece. But we can also shift to thinking about how we incorporate information about dispositions and genetic risk pathways as well. I remember I was doing a panel and talking with someone who is in recovery at another event. And as they were telling their story, they said, and I had talked about genetic dispositions and how they also play a role. And they said, you know, one of my challenges with treatment and recovery has been that everywhere I go, there I am. By that meaning that they were working a lot on their environment, but those internal risk factors, the things that were leading to the development of problems, that they hadn't attended as much to that. And so in the same way that we might work with our clients on identifying what are the environmental risk pieces, right? Be it, you know, friend groups, the people that you hang out with who might be using, and how do you shift that? How do you shift where you spend your time away from risk enhancing environments? How do you come up with supports like recovery communities or recovery housing, et cetera? So we can also have conversations about some of these underlying dispositional styles that represent genetic risk for why some people are more at risk for substance use disorders, and work on addressing those underlying risk factors as well. And so, for example, if any of you are on Twitter, you can follow me at Dr. Danielle Dick, and it's occurring to me, I will go ahead and tweet out after our talk, and then also put it on our website. You can use kind of some of these standard short assessments, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute, as a starting point to have conversations with individuals about different dispositional styles and how that might create challenges, and then putting strategies in place. There's evidence that this works. And so there are new studies coming out that show that matching programs to individuals' risk profiles actually does a better job. So this is the whole idea of how do we move beyond one size fits all. So one example of this, which I will walk you through this graph here, comes from one of my colleagues, Mark Schuckett, who is a psychiatrist out at San Diego. And essentially, he was doing a prevention program with college students. And he was looking at, in this case, physiological response to alcohol. So he was looking at that particular risk pathway. And essentially, we know that some individuals have a lower level of response to alcohol, meaning it takes more drinks for them to feel kind of the buzz that others might feel with a drink or two. It takes more drinks. And of course, what that does is it leads to a heavier drinking pattern so that you can, be having fun with your friends. And that then tends to lead to heavier drinking peer groups and eventually to the development of problems. Well, he actually selected individuals into his study who were either had that low level of response, this is the LRB group, the low level of response, or individuals who did not have that risk factor, who had essentially the high level of response. Now, he didn't explicitly tell individuals you're a low responder, you're a high responder, but he picked individuals who had those two characteristics. And then he assigned them either to sort of intervention as usual, which he calls SOTA for state of the art, kind of the standard intervention, which of course covered issues like drinking to cope and peer substance use and harm reduction techniques and understanding expectancies, et cetera. And then the other group covered all that same information, but it also talked about how low level of response was a risk factor and how that risk factor could contribute to some of these others, having riskier drinking peers, drinking in higher quantities, et cetera. So you have two groups. One of them is getting all the standard information and the other one's getting all the standard information, but is also just talking about level of response. So it's kind of like standard information plus one more little thing. And what he found is that to orient you to this graph, essentially lower scores are better because it indicates a reduction in substance use. These are individuals, these squares here are individuals who were the low responders, the more at-risk individuals. And this is compared to when they were in the level of response group, the group that talked about how level of response was a risk factor, as compared to the standard treatment. And you can see that they did better. There was more of a reduction in alcohol use when they were a low responder and they were in a group that talked about how low level of response was a risk factor. Conversely, and this is one of the pieces I think is most interesting, individuals who didn't carry that risk factor, they did better in the standard treatment. In other words, when you added just one little thing to that treatment, so additional information, they actually didn't reduce their drinking nearly as much. And you might think, well, of course, because they're mismatched. But the reality is, when we just do kind of a standard set of interventions with people, we're mismatching all kinds of people. And presumably, these individuals who actually got the same information, but a little more, and in theory, you might think, so, a little more is better, but they presumably, we hypothesize, kind of tuned out because it was like, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me because they didn't carry that particular risk factor. Another example of this has been taken into the school settings by another colleague, Patricia Conrad. Some of you all might have seen this article in the New York Times. And essentially what she does is focus on these genetically influenced risk pathways, a couple impulsivity and sensation seeking related to externalizing, and then a couple anxiety sensitivity and negative thinking related to internalizing pathways of risk. And then her program Preventure essentially targets school age early teenagers, and they give essentially this assessment. And I will tweet out this assessment for those. It's not geared toward adolescents. You can use it with anyone. And it covers these different personality dimensions because some individuals find it's a helpful place to start conversations in a clinical setting to sort of identify what are an individual's risk factors. She has all the students complete them and then selects the students who had the elevated risk profiles and does 2 hour-and-a-half sessions with the kids and found that it reduced their substance use, effects seen up to 2 years, but it also reduced the substance use of other kids in the school who weren't even in the program. And presumably that's partly because it's reducing the norms of that school surrounding substance use. And the other thing that we know is that adolescents, their brains are also at a time where they tend to be more drawn to risk-taking. And so those students who are higher sensation seekers and more impulsive and more extroverted, they often tend to be kids who are more popular as well, too. Other adolescents are drawn to them, which can contribute to some of these risky patterns of substance use that for individuals that are at risk can subsequently lead to patterns that eventually go on to develop problems. We are working on a program right now with our college students. It turns out, as we know, college students use many substances in risky ways. In particular, we've seen big uptakes in cannabis use and are very concerned about that. Turns out they also have zero interest in participating in substance use prevention programs. So colleges try to do things sometimes like mandate that they can't register for their classes until they've done substance use harm reduction training programs. Students tend to really not like that much. One year when we didn't have it mandated, we had 40 out of our 4,000 incoming students who even went to the website to look at the information. So as a mom, I call this my chocolate covered broccoli technique. In other words, how do you get something that's good for individuals to them in a way that they are also going to enjoy and want to participate in? So it turns out that young people do not want to do substance use prevention programming, but what they do seem to love to do is fill out questionnaires about themselves, right? We see this on Facebook and BuzzFeed quizzes, what kind of dog are you or what superhero are you? What we have done is created this app where students complete questions about themselves. And of course, what they're filling out are questions related to these different dimensions that we know are associated with elevated substance use. And so then we give them a little bit of information about how, we all have unique genetic dispositions that can contribute to differential outcomes in combination with our lived experiences. They build their own avatar, and then they get kind of, personalized risk. And then what we do is for each of these different characteristics, we walk through good things associated with that, which can be very empowering in the sense of knowing, risk-taking is not in and of itself a bad thing. CEOs, fighter pilots are higher on risk-taking. But of course, it can lead to problems if you don't put in place strategies to keep that risk-taking in check. So we talk about some of the not so good, the challenging things that can be associated with that. Even something like anxiety, which students will say, I hate anxiety. I wish I could make it go away. Well, anxiety is what makes us prepare for a presentation or for a meeting or study for the exam the next day. But of course, if you don't have strategies to manage it, too much can lead to problems. And then harmful substance use can be a way that people use to cope. So essentially what we're doing is connecting the literature about individual risk factors, how we know our genes are contributing to differential risk, with classic CBT and harm reduction principles. And so this is some of the work that we have ongoing. We're currently doing a randomized clinical trial of this with the hopes that we will build it out to make it more widely available. And I'll leave you with one last bit of good news, which is not only do we know who's most at risk, one day we will know that through actual genotyping. Today, we can know it through these behavioral characteristics that are indexes of genetic risk for why some people are more likely to develop substance use problems. But we also know that the individuals who are most at risk are the ones who benefit most from intervention. So one final piece of data I'll show you. This is from a study in which we essentially did a middle school-based intervention. It consisted of working with parents, with students. There was information resource rooms in the school. It was done at the school level. So some schools got randomly assigned to having more intervention information, and some schools just sort of did whatever they routinely did for substance use prevention, which generally is not very much in schools and oftentimes not empirically based or evidence-based. We collected DNA from all of those individuals who'd participated in this study, and we went back and followed them, as you can see, in the late 20s. And we looked at the likelihood that an individual had gone on to develop, in this case, alcohol use disorder. And what this shows is along this x-axis here, this is as a function of genetic risk. So creating one of those genetic risk scores. So these are the individuals at low genetic risk, going all the way over here to individuals at high genetic risk. In the control condition, in other words, they really didn't get any intervention, you can see that as expected, as you're at higher genetic risk, there was a much higher probability that they would develop a substance use disorder. In the intervention condition, there was no significant difference as a function of genotype. In other words, our environmental manipulations, giving kids strategies and resources, essentially helped the ones who were most at risk most. They were able to then apply those and to use those strategies to reduce genetic risk. So to sum up, we know that genetics is an important piece of what makes some individuals more at risk for substance use disorders than others. And our understanding of how this genetic risk unfolds, these different pathways by which risk unfolds, can be used to expand our ability, expand the number of tools in our toolkit, essentially, to prevent and to intervene with these incredibly complex and challenging problems. We know that different people have different dispositions, right? They have different stories. They have different routes that got them to a place where they developed problems. For some individuals, it is going to be through pathways that were involved in sensation seeking and impulsivity, and perhaps making more choices that in the short term were more fun or seemed more gratifying, but in the long term were not. In other cases, it's going to be individuals who were using substances to self-medicate. To help individuals understand what are the characteristics and patterns, how their genotypes are contributing to risk, can also allow individuals to put in place strategies, and us to help individuals to put in place strategies in addition to the environmental supports that often we're focused on. We know that dispositions are not destiny, but at the same time, they're not something to be ignored either. We're not all equally at risk, and we can harness this information to develop better prevention and intervention. And with that, I want to wrap up by acknowledging my team who has contributed to many of the pieces of the work that I showed today, as well as our funding from the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, who have funded all of the work that I've discussed today. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I would love to open it up for any of your questions or things that you're interested in discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dick. That was a great presentation. There are a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is, aside from the genome test, is there a screening tool to identify personal dispositions that you're aware of?
Yes. So, I mean, the screening tool really can be as straightforward as some of these short questions that we use, you know, kind of personality type questions, although I hate calling it personality, but that index these sensation seeking, impulsivity, anxiety sensitivity, et cetera. There are many of these, and they're the one that is used by Patricia Conrad and her school-based studies, and that we use when we're having these conversations, is called the SERPs. It's short for the Substance Use Risk Profile, and essentially it takes items from lots of the questionnaires that researchers use that are most predictive of risk factors that lead people to develop problems. And I am happy to make that available to folks as well too. We've created kind of a user-friendly version that's easy for individuals to score. And we use that also as a starting point for conversation, in the same way that you might have conversations about, okay, let's look at your life. Let's think about risk factors, and, you know, what are the pieces that are going on in your life to contribute to substance use disorders. We use this kind of, you know, short little questionnaire as another springboard for conversations about this piece, and maybe putting in place then strategies for dealing with, you know, the anxiety. Because some of these pieces, of course, when there's an anxiety disorder, for example, right, or there's ADHD, or, you know, some of these things that then might get incorporated into clinical treatment. But oftentimes, you know, again, behavior is on a bell curve. And so, you know, knowing that these are characteristics or tendencies, even though they might not otherwise show up because they are not a disorder that we are working on in our treatment, can still open up the conversation to then put supports and strategies in place. So I am happy to share that. You can both I'm trying to think of the easiest way. I will put the website to my lab, or if you Google Danielle Dick VCU, you will come up, you will find your way to my lab website, and I'll do it. When I get off, I'm going to email my assistant and ask her to upload it to our website. So it should be up there in the next 24 hours, and I will put it on our lab website, and I will also tweet it out. Again, if anyone's on Twitter, I can send it out. I'm at Dr. Danielle Dick, and make that available to you all.
Okay. One other question that was asked, is the goal ultimately, or do you believe this is going to help be able to prevent addictions ultimately, and how would that occur?
I hope that it will do both. I hope that it will, and when we talk about genetics and why candidly billions of dollars are being poured into genetic research, it's that it will allow us, it's a two-pronged approach to both preventing and to treating. And so there, on the prevention side, we will at some point have our genetic risk scores for all kinds of things. One of my huge frustration points is that we are putting billions of dollars into gene finding, gene identification, creating these genetic, identifying these genes and creating these genetic risk scores. Comparatively, we're putting far less money into how are we actually going to use them in the clinic in ways that people understand, right? So that they don't come away with a, oh, well, if I'm at high risk for developing a substance use disorder, then why bother? Or if I'm already destined to develop depression, there's nothing I can do. Of course, that's not the way that genetics works, but we need to make sure, we need to all work on getting that message out so that individuals understand, hey, this is complex, right? We're not all at risk. We're not all equally at risk. Some of us are more at risk, but that's not destiny. And the environment comes into play, but we can work on both of those pieces. So we actually have a variety of studies going on about how to explain complex genetic risk, right? Like, what does a genetic risk score mean? It doesn't mean you carry the gene for addiction, right? So what does it mean? How do you help people understand that? How do you couple it with strategies to help with behavior change, right? We know information alone is not very effective. And it turns out that in other fields where they've done that with genetics, it's not very effective there either, right? Just saying, hey, you're genetically at risk for cardiovascular disease, so watch your diet, exercise. Well, of course, it's not that easy, right? So I think the important piece will be, we can use it for prevention, but we need to think about how do we get it to people in a useful, understandable way and couple it with evidence-based strategies and techniques for helping people put the supports and other strategies in place to reduce these genetic risk factors. Then on the other side is the treatment side, where understanding genetics can help us understand the underlying biology of why some people are more at risk than others. And that then opens up new avenues for drug development. And how do we develop medications that could assist, that we could tweak things to, my son has ADHD. And so, and for him, ADHD medications have been great in that they just reel in the impulsivity enough that he can function in a school setting, right? So I think of that as a model for how so we can hopefully, by understanding the underlying genetics, develop drugs that can help individuals, just help shift brain circuitry just a little bit to help reduce risk as well. So I think that genetics has the potential for a two-pronged approach to support prevention and treatment through better pharmaceutical development.
Okay, that's great. So, well, a big question just came in here. Let me see if I can get this whole thing. Again, across the board, people are saying how informative this is, by the way, and how easy you made understanding genetics, which can oftentimes be very, very technical. So really appreciate that. This question is, I'll just read, and very informative. Really liked your illustrations with the two sets of jars showing that some people may need more environmental triggers before developing a problem. They find, however, that some clients, by the time they get to us, may have a jar which has long since overflowed and is now completely buried under a large mound of environmental protectors. In this case, they believe it's more required, more resources for a longer period to to remove or overcome these barriers where someone may feel deeply involved. So how does this impact both the timing and ability to address genetic factors if they come in with already a big bucket of problems, basically?
Yes, that is a great problem, and I'm so glad you posed it. I would say in part, the phenomenon that you described, which I know is not unique, right? And that gets back to the when do we go in to seek help? When we have really, like, we've tried on our own and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And so, by the time people are going in for treatment or help to seek help, oftentimes things are in a really dire state. That is part of the reason for precision medicine, right? The idea that we can hopefully catch people. You could imagine if genetic risk scores at some point become more routine in clinical care, you would hopefully catch people earlier in that process, right? Before all those environmental risks and those problems have built up, right? By recognizing, hey, you're at risk, how are things going? How can we, okay, well, let's intervene now earlier in, say, the development of substance use problems. Okay, that said, that's not today. And today you have someone who has the overflowing orange triangles of environmental risk. So that is why, of course, so often a focus is on the environmental pieces, and obviously they are critical. But the piece I want to emphasize here is that our genes and our environments are not independent things, right? They actually don't just add up quite as easily as as that jar makes it look. And so by that, I mean, we call it gene environment correlation, right? Meaning our genotypes cause us to select into certain environments to a certain degree, right? And so, for example, when I talked about sensation seeking and risk taking, so oftentimes that will lead individuals into environments where there are a lot of drugs, because they're getting something out of that. I work a lot with young people too, right? They are getting social interaction. And, Rodney did a beautiful job too of talking about how in his story, a phenomenon we see where there's a shift from at the beginning, it's fun, it's enjoyable, you're with friends, there's romantic partner interests, that is how so, and that is it's not random oftentimes who ends up in certain settings, right? That there are parts of our dispositions that lead us to select into certain environments that then can cumulatively create more risk. And so I mentioned that because, yes, you're focusing on the environment, but that doesn't mean, well, we've got to focus all these on these environmental pieces before we can get to the, the dispositional or the genetics piece, because very often they're related. Similarly, if we think about, so that's a kind of, the more impulsivity, risk, sensation seeking example, but we also know our genotypes influence the way we respond to the environment. And so individuals who have developed problems surrounding more of, say, that anxiety sensitivity pathway, that oftentimes what might have happened is that, they have gotten into environmental settings or where, let's say, they have totally withdrawn and they don't have a lot of supports because they were dealing with anxiety. They didn't, and that led them to have less contact with family, with friends, etc. I mentioned that because that's another case where you might think about the environment, but the environment is going to be directly related to that person's disposition. And so I think that we can work on them at the same time. And in fact, oftentimes it's more effective to work on them simultaneously because they're related to one another.
Well, Dr. Dick, thank you so much. I'm sure other people have questions, but unfortunately we're reaching the end of our session. Yes, we would be giving you a big round of applause if you were standing on our podium. Again, an excellent presentation, and you made it so simple to understand. I mean, just thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and close. I again want to thank Senator Brown, and I want to thank Rodney. And Rodney, I just have to say, you really are the face of Recovery is Beautiful. Love your shirt. We appreciate all you do for us and all you do for the recovery community.